Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange. Today I want to do a spoiler-free review of 12 Nights at Rotter House by JW Ocker. This is one that I received from the author. Now this is a horror novel that centers around a man named Felix who is a travel writer who likes to write about spooky places and haunted houses. At the beginning of the story, he gets the idea to go and stay for 13 nights in a supposedly haunted house called Rotter's House. But given the title of this book, you can probably guess that things may not go as smoothly as he plans, and he doesn't quite make it to night 13. He wants to capture his experiences by writing a novel, and because he is a skeptic, he decides that the book will be even better if he is accompanied by one of his childhood friends. This man that joins him was his best friend, but you know that something happened and their relationship became very broken, but for whatever reason, his friend decides to join him, and together they are going to spend these 13 nights in this haunted place. If you follow my channel, you might be aware that while I read tons of horror, I'm actually not a huge fan of the haunted house genre, and that's because I feel like these kind of stories can be tired and just overdone. But I'm happy to say that this book is one of those wonderful exceptions. I really enjoyed it. This is the kind of story I would describe to be as very gripping. While I normally describe haunted house stories as being slow or even boring, I was completely immersed in the experience. This is told in a first-person perspective from the narrative point of Felix, and I really think that added to the story. And the character of Felix just tells the story with so much humor while still making the story eerie and creepy, and it was just very engaging to read. I found this book very easy to fly through. I read it in just a few days because I didn't want to put it down, and that's not something I normally would say about a haunted house book, so I've got to give it props there. What I think made this book feel so fresh is the fact that it is very self-aware. I should mention that if the author's name doesn't sound familiar, you should know that he is actually quite well known as a travel writer himself, who also tends to write about spooky places. So there is a level of meta to this book because it is a writer who is telling a fictional story that is perhaps a little more close to home, or at least has that possibility. And that premise alone very much intrigued me to want to check out this book, and it definitely didn't disappoint. The main character in this story is very aware of the tropes and cliches of the horror genre when it comes to haunted houses, and he purposely goes about trying to recreate that experience. So they let their cell phones die, they play with a Ouija board, and do all these other things that you see in all these classic horror movies and horror books, and you really get to see that play out, which was really enjoyable. I really enjoy a story that is aware of itself and knows that the readers going into this have probably read several haunted house stories before, or at the very least are familiar with the storyline because they've watched those kind of movies. And what made this even more fun was the fact that within the story, the characters are constantly dropping references to haunted house books and movies. There are so many pop culture references in this one. Some people might find it excessive, but for me personally, I enjoyed every minute of it. And it was really fun for them to very vocally talk about the tropes of the haunted house genre as they were experiencing them themselves. So I think this book will appeal to people who enjoyed Kill Creek by Scott Thomas, because that is another haunted house story that is very meta. At this point, I have not read that one, but I do think the comparison is fair. And this one was just so enjoyable. While I call this book a fresh take on a haunted house story, I need to be clear that I still found it to be predictable. Because this book is all about recreating the haunted house experience, they really do go through those classic steps, and the story for the most part does go where you would expect it to go. I've seen other reviewers gush about some twist or turn in this book that you will never see coming, and that really changed my expectations when I went into this one. I made a prediction to myself when I started reading this about how the story was going to end, and honestly, for the most part, I did guess exactly what was going to happen. So I think for someone like myself who reads a ton of horror, you might find this story particularly ending a little bit cliche, a little bit predictable, but while I say that, it did not diminish my experience of this book. I still thoroughly enjoyed it, was slightly disappointed by the ending only because so many other reviewers promised that I would never guess it, and I basically guessed it within a couple chapters. But regardless, I thoroughly enjoyed this. I would reread this, which I don't actually say about a lot of horror stories, but this one is so much more about the experience than a surprise ending. So if you're someone who likes haunted house stories, I definitely recommend checking this out. There are so many nods and winks that you'll just appreciate. And if you're someone like me who doesn't enjoy the subgenre, I would still recommend this one because it kind of makes fun of haunted house stories in a way and points out all the ridiculous things that always happen in those books. So this was just so much fun, and I definitely think this would be a perfect book to read in the fall winter season because it had a good atmosphere. It was a little bit creepy. While it is a little more meta, I wouldn't say it's the scariest book I've read, but it definitely still played into those psychological aspects that people love so much about haunted house stories, and I would recommend it just about to anyone apparently. So if you have already read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts down below, as long as you keep them spoiler free. And if you haven't read this book, let me know if I have convinced you to check it out. I personally think it is one of the best new releases I've read in quite a while, and I would love to see more people talking about it online. So that is it for this video. Please consider commenting, and subscribing, especially if you enjoy horror and other creepy things as much as I do. Thank you as always, and I will talk to you soon in another video. Okay, bye-bye.